Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. People who inhabit the border regions of any country often find themselves being treated with a mixture of suspicion and opportunity by the metropoles of those countries. Khuzestan, Iran's border province with Iraq, is no different. Famed for its Arab population, the Arabs of Khuzestan have been at the center of the 20th century's modernization projects, tensions between neighbours, and the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. But one does not need to live in close proximity to a physical border to be seen as a person within the modern nation state project as a border person. Running parallel to the experiences of the Arabs of Iran are the Iranians of Iraq, who were a cause of anxiety for nationalist regimes in Baghdad. What can we learn about history and politics through the prism of people who inhabited the boundaries of the Middle Eastern's nation state project? Joining us to help us answer this question is Shaherazad Ahmadi. Shaherzad Ahmadi earned her BA from the University of California, Davis in history. After graduation, she studied Persian and Arabic in Tehran before moving to Austin, Texas for her PhD at UT Austin's Department of History. Her research on Arab Iranians in the Iran-Iraq borderlands animates both her scholarly articles in her top journals in her field, as well as her book published by UT Austin Press, Bordering on War, which we've also reviewed in the Middle East Monitor, and you can read. Shaherazad Ahmadi, welcome to Memo Conversations.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate being here.
It's a great pleasure for us to have you. I sort of want to begin, before we sort of get into the subject itself and what drew you to it, I'm kind of curious a little bit about your sort of background. I mean, you obviously grew up in the US, from what I can tell, but you went back to Iran to study. Is that correct?
That's right. So I grew up in California, in the Bay Area, and I earned my degree, as you said a moment ago, in the UC system. I went to UC Davis. And after graduation, I spent some time in Tehran, where I studied language, but also started to conceive of the project and learn how to do research in archives, which is what propelled me to my graduate program.
So this is going to be a kind of interesting question, actually. How did you sort of how does your sort of experience of being in Iranian academia compare to your experiences in US academia? Like when it comes to sort of teaching and research that you're sort of taught to do and how they sort of get you to sort of do all of this, what would you say were the major sort of differences? What were the similarities?
So I haven't had the pleasure of teaching history in Iran. So I was studying language, but when I compare the work that historians in Iran do with the work that historians of Iran in the West do, they're asking very different questions. They have very different methods, and they have access to very different materials. So what you find from historians in Iran are very rich data analyses. They were able to spend significant time in the archive so they can do these kinds of projects. Historians in the US are, particularly in the US, but also I would say in the kind of Anglo-speaking world, English-speaking world, are working on questions that fit within different methodological lenses. So whether it's gender, whether it's immigration, there's much greater emphasis on your training resulting in a very specific final product. So that's what I would say would be the difference.
Indeed. And I think it's interesting because one of the things I've sort of noticed when it comes to looking at scholarship produced on it about Iran in the West is I can say that in the last 15 years, there's been a vast improvement in the sort of books and studies that have been coming out. I mean, if I think before 2010, you were very limited in the options of what you could read, and they were all very similar people doing it with very similar angles and very similar ideas. But after 2010, we noticed this big blossoming of entirely new questions and scholarship that was in completely different fields but did very different things. So I think your book, Bordering on War, is part of that sort of trend that we sort of see after 2010, from what I can tell.
I appreciate you saying that, and I also agree with you. There was a shift in archival access, which might be what you're observing, that there was a brief period, particularly after President Obama negotiated the deal with Iran, that allowed for American scholars, particularly young American students. There were many of us graduate students floating in the archives in Iran in this period of between 2011 to 2000, I want to say 17, 18 is when things started getting a little bit more challenging. And you do see a blossoming of very interesting research questions. I mean, I have colleagues who started writing about racial construction in Iran in ways that had not been described before because they were accessing Qajar archives. I have friends who were doing all kinds of really interesting research on ethnic minorities that they simply didn't have access to up until that point. So I completely agree with you. There was a real blossoming and flourishing.
Indeed, and this sort of now brings us to the topic that you sort of explored. So, if we could sort of, before we sort of get to the book itself, could you perhaps tell us what was it that interested you in Khuzestan more generally, as well as the question of the Arabs of Khuzestan? What got you interested in this at all?
It's an important question. It's also interesting. When I give talks, the question I often get is, are you an Arab Iranian? Is that why you explored this topic? I'm not. In fact, my curiosity about this was twofold. One, when I was living in Iran, I was incredibly fascinated by the Iran-Iraq War and the legacy of the war. And my initial project was that I pitched to my graduate program was I want to write a study of the war that does not emphasize martyrdom, that does not emphasize the military component, sort of the military aspect, but delves into subject matters that I did later write about, for example, housing, for example, internal migration. There was just so much information about that that had not been written in the West. Um, and then when I went to my graduate program, UT Austin at that time had a very robust Arabic language program. And I started working with a professor who became my co-supervisor, who was an Arabist. And so it just started pushing me in this direction of thinking through what had up until that point been elided as nonsensical, which is that Saddam Hussein never had a prayer to win over the Arab population of Iran. And I just started to take this more and more seriously. The more I read these very self-assured scholarly journals of there was no way that the Arabs would ever do this, I thought, well, how do we know that? Do we know that? Why do we know that? And so that was the entry point that I wanted to write about the war, but I also wanted to write about it from a perspective that was novel.
It's kind of interesting when you say that because it sort of parallels the sort of discussions around the Iraqi Shia themselves when, as you all know, in 1982, I believe, during the war, the Iranians managed to expel the Iraqis from Iran and then they crossed into Iraq. But they failed to trigger a general uprising among Iraqi Shia like they were expecting to. And very similar answers were given there that, of course, the Iraqi Shia were never going to side with the invading force. And of course, their loyalty was assured. But it's a very interesting thing because not only is that, obviously that's with hindsight they didn't uprise, but it wasn't known to people at the time that this wouldn't happen. I mean, even the Iraqi authorities didn't know this wouldn't happen. So, plus,
Exactly. One thing I just to what you're saying, at around the time that I was beginning this inquiry, more and more scholars were accessing the Hoover Institute archives at Stanford, so the Ba'ath Party records. And Dina Khouri's book came out, Iraq in Wartime, and that hugely influenced me. And she took this matter really seriously. Why didn't the Shiis in Iraq um, feel more compelled by Khomeini's message? And she, although that wasn't her research question, she was much more interested in how the bureaucracy formed and how Saddam Hussein was able to consolidate his rule. She did give very good answers to this question, and answers that I found so compelling that they really shaped the questions I was asking about Iran. So I agree with you. I think that there has been a reflexive acceptance that nationalism succeeded, even as historians have written that nationalism is an imagined construct and it might not resonate with people. And so this dilemma to answer why it did resonate when it resonated, I think is really valuable for us to think about during these historical flashpoints, like during a war, for instance.
Indeed, and I'm sort of now wondering because obviously when we think about nationalism, we have a very particular image of nationalism within the Iranian context, which is very similar to other contexts, to be fair, which is that there's a very proud non-Arab Persian identity which underpins it all. At least that's how it seems to us on the outside. So, with that in mind, how do you think Iranian society more generally today sort of sees the population of Khuzestan and the Arabs of Khuzestan, and how do they sort of fit within that sort of pantheon of ideas about nationalism?
That is my project, basically. That's exactly what caused me to consider the issue of Arab Iranians in that there was both their experience, which I was very interested in, but also the way that Iranians imagined them. So if you were to walk through any major urban area of Iran, the murals are filled with imagery of Khuzestan. In a way, the whole country has cocooned itself in the geography and topography of Khuzestan. You have the palm trees, you have the deserts, and that's actually not, that's unique to that area of southern Iran. You go to northern Iran, it's very lush, it's very green. There is something about Khuzestan that is both immediately identifiably Khuzestan and clearly connected to the war. You see this scene and you reflexively expect a soldier, that there is a soldier coming out of the palm grove. So that fascinated me, that on the one hand, you have this population in the South that doesn't quite meet the criteria of a kind of 20th century Iranian heritage model because of the population and on the demographics. And on the other hand, it is that area geographically has become intrinsic core to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And my argument, sort of the way that I started to think about this was that the war offered Arab Iranians an opportunity to articulate themselves as not only a beleaguered demographic, beleaguered and put upon by this Arab regime next door, but also a population that had made enormous sacrifices and therefore deserved enormous gratitude from the public. And that had not previously existed. Up until that point, they were considered really a problematic. How do we neutralize this population? How do we deal with them? And in many ways, the war did not resolve this problem. There is still a lot of migration in this area. There's still a lot of confusion about where people are from. And at the same time, it did resolve the question of whether or not they would ally with a neighboring state. That did resolve in some way.
So I now want to sort of take a bit of a step back now, and talk about so I've got some questions that are related to the Iranians in Iraq, but before we sort of get there too, I wonder if you could just give us a brief sketch of the history of Arabs in Khuzestan. How did they sort of find themselves in this region? What is their actual historical relationship like to this area? And, how has it sort of changed over time?
So Arabs have been in this area for a very long time, since Arabs have been in the general area um, of the Gulf. So Khuzestan, the word Khuz is a very old, ancient word. Um, and it's not Arabic, but when the Arabs arrived, they used that terminology for the area. It was actually a very important site for ancient Persia, despite the heat, one would think, but no, it was very important. Um, the the area became increasingly dependent on seafaring, or basically the trade along the Gulf and the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Karun River, the Shatt al-Arab. And it was basically a very not populated. I don't want to exaggerate and say it was very sparsely populated. Given the geography, it couldn't sustain a large population, but it was an area that was, let's say, less developed. Um, and when early European, let's say, surveyors arrived to the area of Khuzestan, what they described was a place that was really demographically mixed and very tribal in orientation. So your loyalty was to your tribe. There was some mapping with ethnicity, and in other words, certain tribes spoke certain languages. Um, but it was just very diverse. There were Lors, there were of course Banu Qab, which is the major tribe that I write about. But there were also Persians. It was a very diverse area. And so what the reason the area becomes more populated is because of the discovery of oil. And so once oil is discovered, it becomes a magnet. And one of my questions early in the book is, a lot of us assume that this is a heavily, densely Arab populated area, but is that true? What areas were actually Arab populated? And this is a matter of great concern for neighboring Iraq, because if you're going to stake a claim, you have to have the demographics. You have to have some sense of who lives where. And Iran was always very uncomfortable with having ethnic demographic census data. And so we can only speculate. But the Arabs have been there, like I said, for a long time, for many hundreds of years. That area was the area that we understand as Khuzestan is a big province. And I'm most interested in that borderland that had historically been populated by Arabs.
Indeed. And as you were sort of saying, they've been there for hundreds of years. But if we sort of think about Iran's southern coast up until about the 19th century, or even just past it, there were many different Arab populations that were coming over, weren't there? I mean, a large chunk of the sort of tribes coming from the United Arab Emirates today were originally on the other side of and they were involved on fishing and, you know, sailing and pirating and all the other stuff they were doing on both sides because they settled on both sides.
That's absolutely right. There's actually been very good research about this just in the last couple of years about just how much movement there was in the Gulf. So, one thing that I didn't take up as much in my book, but has been explored by other historians. There's one in particular at NYU who just recently wrote a book about this, that there's the trade in this area brought a huge, I mean, it created a concentration of Bahrainis, Emiratis, a lot of people in this area of Khuzestan. And then on the other hand, these Khuzestanis were finding themselves in these other areas to engage in trade and settle. This period of time at the turn of the 20th century, there was a lot of both movement and settlement as a result of state measures to have clearer ideas of demographics and populations. This is also when you see this region that will become Iraq become predominantly Shia. Up until that point, it wasn't. This is something very interesting from Yitzhak Nakash's work, which was from the late 90s. That, up until the turn of the 20th century, we can talk about a Mesopotamia, Iraq, that was Sunni. And so that's also a recent development. So there's a lot of changes going on. And then oil is discovered, at which point this area becomes another cause for change.
Yes, that's actually a very important point that in the 19th century we did start to see a mass conversion of the south of Iraq to Shiism. It's also parallel to the development of, I think, Karbala, where I believe it was Karbala where new roads and stuff were built so that people could access. But that's Iraqi history. That's a bit beyond the scope of this present conversation. But I do sort of just want to pull you up on this point. So you had obviously other Arab communities in the south from the Gulf. What was the sort of relationship like between, as far as you can tell, your subject in Khuzestan with these other ones?
So one thing that I was very interested in was so there's merchant movement, which of course is really hard to grasp. The surveillance state is unsophisticated, underdeveloped. We don't have a lot of information about this, but we do know that there was also a lot of movement because of labor. So many people are moving all over the Gulf looking for work. And we know that these people were going back and forth to visit family, to send money. So one thing that stood out to me right away was that in this moment of the turn of the 20th century, a lot of people are making serious assessments. And this has been documented by other historians as well. They're making serious assessments about where their bread is being buttered and what citizenship they should be applying for. And again, this is part of my overall question. Then why were they so loyal when their citizenship might have been a matter of expedience? And so, one thing that you find a lot of in Khuzestan are people who say, actually, my family is originally from Bahrain. That's extremely common. And so it's just a matter of happenstance that they ended up in Khuzestan. They might not have been there for very long. Um, this has been a lot more described on the Iraqi side because so many Iranians ended up on the Iraqi side and maintained their Iranian citizenship to get out of military service. And so you see this sporadic movement back and forth when people of Iranian descent might have recognized that they needed to make some kind of declaration, otherwise they would be drafted. So it's very interesting to me how underplayed that movement was, which is part of why I thought it wasn't unreasonable for Saddam Hussein to think potentially if they could have become citizens of Iran or Bahrain, why not Iraq? That kind of malleability was there.
Indeed, and it's also just before we get on to the Iraqi Shia question, because that's another one, particularly the Iranians who live in Iraq. But we did sort of see, particularly in the late 19th century, a lot of migration away, well, maybe more in the 20th century, away from Iran, from these Arab tribes in the south. But we don't seem to see this necessarily in the case of Khuzestan. So, what was the actual difference between them in that regard?
Can you repeat what you said? So what do you mean? Can you just
So,
clarify who that's
for
moving?
example, a lot of people, tribes from the United Arab Emirates were on the southern coast, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, as the Tehran's control over the area starts to build up more and more,
Right,
you
right.
start to see a migration away back to the United Arab Emirates or other areas of the Gulf, but we don't necessarily see that universally, as is the case of Khuzestan. So, what accounts for that?
So this is one of the like great challenges of studying immigration that everyone's story is so different. You can say that there are political flashpoints. So there are reasons that people move at particular moments. But one of the things that I really struggled with in researching this was so many of these stories were really individual. It was like somebody had found out that they could go to school somewhere, and that was more, let's say, reasonable than going to school in Iran. And then they just sort of stayed there once they got there. So 100%, when there was tension with Iran, there was movement, always. So I mean, Iran also escalated its aggression in some areas when it would identify opportunities in its own territorial ambitions. Um, it's interesting to me also like this is well documented. Of course, we discussed this particularly with tensions between Iran and Iraq on these issues. But the story of Iran's own ambitions are often underplayed. There was a lot of Arabs in the South, and I think you were mentioning this a moment ago that there are Baluchis in the South. There are like major populations of Arabs in southern Iran that are moving constantly, and the state is very aware of it. And they're also very aware that their policies result in this movement. So, absolutely, the early 20th century story to me is most volatile and mysterious because we just have less information about it because the state wasn't as aggressively involved in it.
Yeah, so Baluch is another story. There's
Yes.
been less research on that, I think. So now I also want to quickly talk a little bit about the Iranians in Iraq. I mean, what do we mean when we say Iranians in Iraq? And also, what is the sort of history here? I mean, when you think about it, you could always say that there's always going to be migration between the two countries. They're very close to each other, and especially after the adoption of Shiism in Iran, you've got pilgrimage sites going into certain cities in Iraq. So there's surely constant migration. So what is the sort of history of why a number of Iranians settled in Iraq? What can we sort of say about that?
So I had a really hard time, and I don't know if this was noticeable from the language of my book, but I really struggled with how to define this community. And I must have gone through like 4 iterations of what to call them. Um, and then having to search for every instance to make sure I was being consistent through the book. So the way I think of them are Iraqis with Iranian descent. And I frame it that way because there were many Iranians of Iraqi descent. In other words, they might have been geographically tied to this other place, but they might not have had any actual connection to this other place. And now the numbers of this are really confusing. The Ba'ath Party in the later 60s will say that about 10% of Iraq was of Iranian descent. This seems very high to me. But that number, for some reason, stuck in the imagination of most political leaders. And so you get very, I'll say wildly high numbers projected. Um, these Iraqis of Iranian descent, in my mind, fall in 2, potentially 3 categories. One are those who had been in Iraq for several generations, but maintained serious ties in Iran, meaning they would go back and forth and visit family, they would do business. They might have even held on to some kind of Iranian documentation, they might not, but they had some connection. Then you have another category that were Iranian citizens who lived and operated in Iraq. And in some cities, that was not an insignificant number. That was in a place like Karbala or Najaf, those would have been significant numbers of these types of Iranians. And then you have this third category, which was very statistically significant, which is what makes the terminology challenging for me. And that is people who were of Iranian descent who had no connection to Iran. So they didn't have citizenship. Their family had been in Iraq for several generations. If they were expelled, they would have had nowhere to go in Iran. And that portion was massively underplayed in Western media, and then in a way also focused on almost entirely by Iranians, as how could you expel these people because none of them have any kind of connection to Iran. So it's very interesting to see how this was played. And I try to get numbers on this from the expulsions, and we know that a very significant portion had no connection.
Yes, it's a very interesting issue because even now, when we look at Iraq, one of the most important political and religious figures in Iraq currently, Sistani, is of
Yeah.
Iranian descent. And as far as I know, he doesn't even have an Iraqi passport, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
He's a very interesting character, and Iranian scholars he's a very interesting character, and still speaks Arabic in a very strong Persian accent. Persian accents are hard to resolve. You're right. And part of the struggle that various Iraqi Republican presidents had, meaning after the monarchy fell, was trying to identify in particular the ulama. That was the demographic that they really struggled with and wanted to be independent of. And they felt that Shi'i influence from Iran would be most directly passed to their population through that ulama.
So to sort of understand this a little bit better, was the sort of concern for the Iraqi Republicans of the 58 generation simply extraterritorialism, i.e., the idea that because you've got Iraqi Shia and you've got some of them who are Iranian, their loyalty be with more with Iran, which sort of harms the sort of borders that you want to build? Or is it also in connection to that a kind of secularizing effort where you don't want to have the religious establishment having a say over your politics, or at least not without your sort of authority over it. And fear that because they're Shi'i, because they have certain traditions, and because there's certain stereotypes about them, their loyalties to certain scholars, their houses, and how all of this works, that they will bring in a kind of religious politics that is not welcome in the new republic.
I think for certainly what the latter portion of what you said is completely accurate. They were very worried about foreign influence. The other thing, I don't write so much about this in the book, but I've written about it elsewhere. Both Iran and Iraq were very concerned about underpopulation, and they wanted to encourage either migration to their country. There was a major program in Iran to encourage in the 20s and 30s people who had left Iran in what they considered the decaying, decrepit Qajar years to return to Iran. That would include people who are living in Iraq, but also in the whole Gulf area. And on the other hand, they were very concerned about bringing in foreign influence. The Iraqi extraterritorial claim from the 58 period, from that when Abdul Qaim Qasim takes over, that, from my perspective, from the documents I've looked at, and I'm very eager to see other researchers examine this, it seems to me that he did not actually have a kind of cultural investment in Khuzestan. That for him, there was a real interest in the oil, and there was a real interest in maximizing profits from trading in this area. However, he did consider this population potentially problematic for Iran, for Iraq. At the same time, he did have this concern about underpopulation. So he did want tribes that straddled the border to stay on the Iraqi side of the border. And that, to me, is what defines the Pan-Arab period. Not that the Arif brothers are exactly going to categorize themselves as cleanly as we would like in that category, but their concern was less acute on the Shi'i side and more acute on the we want to maximize the number of Arabs we have and their productivity in our country. So it's very interesting to see this transition that Qassem begins this inquiry: who lives where should they be living, what should we be doing, but in a maybe less sincere way, and then it gets taken up later.
So why do you think then different Iraqi administrations? I mean, obviously, by the 1980s, you had Saddam Hussein deporting a lot of who he suspected were Iranians. Why wasn't there sort of why didn't they go down the road of let's just thoroughly Arabize them to the most extreme extent? What was it about expelling them? Why did they decide to go with this?
So this is where I hope my book makes some broader contribution to the story of immigration, that these periods of expulsion tell us something about the way that immigrants animate anxiety in states. So why then? Why? Because one of the things that I think about all the time with regard to the to the Iraqis of Iranian descent is that they were, by and large, very productive in local economies. These were merchants. These were people whose absence would be felt. And the question mark for me is what did they think that they were immediately getting out of it? And to me, this seems like an opportunity for both the Arif brothers, because they go through periods of expulsion as well, and Saddam Hussein, to free themselves of people, of individuals, not of communities, but of individuals that they thought were posed a problem. And instead of imprisoning them, deporting them. That to me is the answer, the underlying answer to the question. And that's something that I try to argue. It's something, when I was looking at the Hoover Institution records, I was very nervous that I was misreading things. I thought, am I understanding the numbers right? It doesn't seem like very many people were deported. I mean, I had come into it assuming that something like 200 to 700,000 people had been deported. There would be an enormous, and I look forward to seeing if there are historians who read the records differently or find some trove that I didn't see. But there are now about 3 different historians who've looked at the same records and say we're looking at like 20 to 30,000 people per wave of expulsion. And it was very targeted. They wanted to know exactly who the people were. And so it doesn't seem to me that Saddam Hussein had it in his mind that Iranian heritage Shi'is were a specific problem. It was that these particular individuals might pose a problem and we can deport them. So let's just deport them. But if this person was a Ba'ath Party member and was totally loyal and was in the army, do not deport them. They are not a problem. So it seems to me, at least, that what this illustrates is that states themselves have internalized the language of loyalty as really what nationalism represents. And that is something that also tracks in a way with some of the Soviet Union research, which I'm very interested in. Much like the research on Iran, Soviet research had this similar flourishing, like all of a sudden, as soon as the Soviet Union fell. But there's some very interesting studies on particularly deportation in the Soviet Union that kind of tracks in this direction.
Indeed, it's interesting if you think about the general question of deportation. You can see the creation of the nation through deportation.
Yes.
Um, I mean, that's true for America as well. I mean, there was a great series I was listening to on the Ottoman History podcast called Deporting Ottoman Americans. And it's all about the ways in which America's deportation regime in the 1920s helped foster the creation of America as an idea.
That's so interesting. The some of the best research in my view on Middle Eastern immigration comes from Levantine research in general. And um, I'm very influenced by those scholars. One of the things that I thought a lot about also in line with that is how gendered some of this is, although it's not my topic and I don't delve into it. Something Akram Khateh writes about for Lebanon that so much of the story about immigration is both about self-definition. How do you articulate yourself? And that is necessarily family oriented, gender oriented. But then how does the rest of the nation see you and internalize you? Can they digest you? This is the ongoing thing that immigrants are butting up against. And you're right. I think it shares a lot of overlap with other areas. Um, One of the things that I was asked recently at a talk was, in what ways does this overlap with other areas of Iran? And I said very confidently, oh, I think it overlaps with other areas of Iran a lot. And one of the respondents said, but there is something unique about this too, in a way, that it's both a water border and there is a neighboring state that has such an assertive claim being made in a way that they weren't making those claims, for instance, for Kurds, who are also on the border and also share a lot of heritage. And so you're right, there's both overlap, and then there's these areas where it is kind of every immigration borderland area is unique.
Yes, it's interesting. And so I wanted to bring this up now because a central theme of your book is the so-called question of loyalty, but not just loyalty viewed from the prism of the state, but thinking about loyalty functionally from the perspective of the subjects that you're writing about. Because I think you've made a very clear point in the book that there's a tendency to view everybody within the nation state as being sort of the passive receivers of an idea coming from centralizing authority. So Tehran, Baghdad, they defied everything, and everyone else is a sort of has to go along. They're sort of hapless. They're not really active agents in this fate. But what you're pointing out in the book, and you spend a lot of time talking about, is the ways in which peoples in these areas and these regions, and obviously particularly border people, are active agents in that fate. And so, how does the question of looking at loyalty through the lens of, let's say, these border people help us understand all of this, how they asserted themselves?
So this is something else that I've been thinking a lot about since writing the book. I had a mentor ask me if maybe I was being overly optimistic in the book, that um, so much of the research done on immigrants, to me, centered on the ways in which immigrants that states had placed immigrants in certain confines that they could not exit or they struggled to operate within. And one of my, what I hoped was a contribution was that there is also a reciprocal dialogue between not just immigrants, but people in borderlands that are, let's say, suspect in some way to states, that there is a means, there are mechanisms through which they can articulate themselves to states. And they can be, I don't want to say dishonest, but they can use the system to their benefit. They can take advantage of that system. So, for instance, one thing that I was very interested in was the ways in which Arabs in Khuzestan could perhaps lobby for better schools by saying, "Well, we'll just send our kids to the local Iraqi Jewish school." And the monarchy panics and says, "Well, we need to make a better investment in schools because what if they send?" And to me, that was an excellent opportunity to consider the leverage that people in general have, whether they're, and some of those kids were not even Iranian citizens. Some of them were actually in the record Bahraini, for instance. But Iran said, "You're in Iran. We want you to go to Iranian schools." And so that is incredibly meaningful to me to consider more broadly. I think all of us come to our research with some kind of perspective, whether it's like ideological or methodological. And one of the things that I feel very strongly is that every individual has agency and we have a means of shaping a narrative. And so I was searching for that evidence. But I think there's another way of looking at it, which is that they felt required to articulate themselves as loyal, which is in a way buying into the nation state framing. So there's two ways of reading this. I completely appreciate that. Nevertheless, there is clearly a reciprocal relationship if the state can say, as the Iraqi state often said, "I think you should be deported," and the individual responds by saying, "I don't want to be deported. Here's all the reasons that I think I shouldn't be deported." And the state, which has so much power, backs down and says, "You're right. We don't think you should be deported." So that language of loyalty, which to me becomes the hallmark of the nation state project, has not been fruitfully examined through the prism of immigration. How do immigrants find that language and utilize it so that they can work, so that they can send their kids to school? And once we more fully appreciate that, we can understand the way that states respond to those communities.
It was also an interesting point within the book because there was a question I sort of had about subversion of loyalty. Because on the one hand, we have, let's say, the population of Arabs of Khuzestan. Of course, it's on an individual basis, where they would perhaps be quite overtly loyal to the, let's say, the Iran and be loyal to this as a project, but they will happily subvert it in various ways, whether they were doing this consciously or not, whether that was through walking across the border with Iraq and just buying whatever they wanted, or smuggling things in, or whatever. And I sort of had to sort of wondered whether this was a conscious subversion or whether this was just, well, this is just how we live. We don't see this as a loyalty issue.
That is exactly how I understood it. I mean, when I first looked at the early 20th century movement in particular, so up until once we enter the Qasem period, the movement becomes much more intense. There's just more intensity around that. But especially early on, I didn't see it as subversion. And that there was a lot of very interesting research about tribal movement that had been framed as subversion. And I think this is also part of a broader trend to politicize even mundane actions in the Middle East. So there was a great article years ago by an anthropologist whose name I really struggle to say, so I won't try. I'll butcher it. But the title of the book, or the title of the article in Iranian Studies, was "Classy Kids and Down at Heel Intellectuals," and it was basically about the fact that we often project onto people the politics that we wish they had. So, like a girl wearing makeup in let's say Tehran, where this is very famous, and there are all these laws, but they don't want to wear hijab, and they don't. And so we project onto them. This was written before Massa. I think this is the dialogue has changed since Massa. But you would walk through the streets of Tehran, see all this makeup, and you go, ah, they're political. They're saying something about the regime. And the author, the anthropologist, said, really, they're trying to get a boy to notice them. It's not about like politics at all. And that really influenced me. I thought, how much of this are we hoping is, or we're kind of projecting as anti-national, when really it's like, I want to visit my cousin, and the police officer who's accosting me is an annoyance, but I can pay him, and I'm not like against the system. The other thing that made me think this way is that we as Westerners fully appreciate that there is a very large contingent of our population that is apolitical, disaffected, disengaged. And yet it's really difficult to then say that the same thing is true in a place like, let's say, Iraq, where surely people would have been even less engaged because the operation of the state was less sophisticated. So it just seemed very natural to me that these had nothing to do with politics. And even later, people understood, when you would get, if someone was engaged in a kind of mercantile trade and they were in Iraq and they shouldn't have been, what would they always say? I'm here on pilgrimage. I'm just going to see X, Y, and Z. And that to me, again, it just didn't read very political. I thought they're finding a means to navigate the system. So that was kind of the world that I wanted to live in. I wanted to create a space for a world in which Middle Easterners were apolitical. How does that look? And so that was, and then when they become political, it's in this very um, simplistic way. "Oh, how could you accuse me? I am totally loyal to the metro," because that's the one thing they know. They know that there is a capital, they know there is a state, they should be loyal to the state. But their knowledge of that state might be very surface level. Their knowledge of that. So I was trying to tease that out. How do we understand that language develop? And when do we see it deployed, especially later on?
What's also interesting is, as you sort of note in your book, is that it sort of give right in sort of the 1920s and onwards to like 80, it goes on, is that it sparks a lot of interest in both Iran in terms of in terms of journalism, in terms of academia, as well as in Iraq. And it gives flowering to a number of different fields, sort of come out of it, trying to understand this phenomena of border people and of the Khuzestani. So you have anthropologists, geographers, all sorts of people going out and trying to understand all of this. So talk to us a little bit about this and the sort of ideas that were sort of emerging around this time.
So ideas about nationalism that were emerging at this time, or
Specific to going to understand and study Khuzestan and the Arabs of Khuzestan and how they fit
oh,
into things.
okay. You mean from the perspective, just to be clear, from the perspective of the early nationalists in that period, or from the perspective of historians looking at it now?
Nationalists in that period.
In that period, okay. So, um, one of the first sources that I read that got me hooked, so to speak, to this project was a very early Iraqi source that I think it was definitely from the Hashemite period, but it was describing Khuzestan, and notably, he did not describe Khuzestan as an extension of Basra. And it made me think, well, at this time, actually, it would have really been an extension of Basra. Like at the time period that this was being articulated, that would have been most accurate. And yet, he was totally engaged in building the nation of Iraq. And the nation of Iraq did not include Khuzestan. So he wasn't going, why confuse the matter? The nation is nascent. Why would you want to introduce a territorial problem to a nation that just had come into existence? By the 1950s, it was very commonplace for Iraqi historians, now confident that the international community accepted their territorial boundaries, to make extraterritorial claims. Now it was a different kind of I don't want to call it propaganda, but a different kind of discourse. And that was from the Iraqi side, that was very interesting to me. From the Iranian side, you would never hear Basra is an extension of Khuzestan. And to me, that meant something. It meant, on the one hand, that Iraqis were trying to articulate their consensus about Iraqi Shi'is in the South. And particularly for Iraqi Shi'i scholars, there was no problem with absorbing those in Iran because they were their brothers. But for the Iranian nationalists, Khuzestan was already a problem. And so they would never have dreamed, despite the fact that Basra had oil, they would never have dreamed to say, well, just as Khuzestan is core to us, because they did not feel that Khuzestan in the 1920s and 30s, I mean, they did not feel that way. Just as Khuzestan is core to us, Basra is core to us. You just don't see that kind of discourse. In fact, you see early nationalists from this period saying Khuzestan is a real problem that we have to neutralize. And very early Pahlavi nationalism, when Reza Shah was building his career, it was around this issue of Khuzestan and their effort to become more independent. So they didn't have this sensibility. And the fact that these two countries, who both supposedly had trouble with this demographic, approached that demographic very differently, told me that that demographic had a different role in their nationalisms. That Iraqi nationalists were more comfortable with Arab Shi'is than Iranian nationalists were with Arab Shi'is, despite their shared Shi'ism. So Arabs for early nationalists were a problem. By the time you get to the 60s, 70s, there was a real concerted effort among Iranian nationalists to neutralize this anti-Arabism, in large measure because it was so thoughtless. I mean, it was very, why would you want to alienate a population that's sitting on so much oil? It just didn't make any sense. So that discourse changes in the 60s and 70s. But once you have the Islamic Revolution, there's a real aggressive pitch. You're Shi'i, we're Shi'i. It's about Shi'ism. And that clearly also did not completely land for the Arabs of this area. And that also is interesting to think about. What does land for them is the immediate, as the immediate typically lands for disaffected, kind of less engaged demographics. And I would say that that's most people. I'm not saying that that's, once they are in a position where they recognize that it's an either or proposition. And that was an argument that I was also making in my book, that the Arabs of Iran never said that they wanted to be part of Iraq. That was never part of their kind of ideological vision. They wanted more independence from Tehran. But once Iraq invades, then they have to clarify, no, we don't want that. We would rather have this. Although, to be fair, from their perspective, they had never said that they wanted Saddam Hussein. So this was kind of an invented anxiety for the Iranians. So it was very interesting for me to see that the nationalist mentality operated so differently with the same community for the two neighboring countries.
It's interesting because the accumulative effect of all this is that you had two nation states effectively trying to win over this same population. And so, particularly by the 1980s, so if you're living in Khuzestan, in many ways, you had a interesting, relationship to sort of, in a sense, global cosmopolitanism, because you're taking in Iraqi media because you can speak Arabic and there's stuff that's targeted at you, but you're also taking in Iranian media. And
Oh,
so you have
yeah.
access to all these different sources of information. You can cross pretty easily. And that sort of changes the way society is compared to, say, perhaps if you just grew up in Tehran, right?
Absolutely. This is one thing that I emphasize in the book, that you see that Arabs in both Iran and Iraq are consuming the media of both sides. And they're most engaged when things are immediately affecting them. So if there is a crisis at the border, they're really engaged because it affects them. If there is an effort to, let's say, build a dam, and that affects local agriculture. They're there, they're listening. Again, that is local loyalty to me, because what it illustrates is that Tehran's interests and Baghdad's interests do not align with these people's interests. And actually, their interests are much more aligned with people who are just across the border from them. And so they're consuming the same media, they're consuming the same kind of, I want to say rhetoric, because they're exposed to the same rhetoric they hear from Iran and Iraq. And they're making very personal decisions based on that. You know, where should we live? Where should we go to school? What should we do? So, yes, absolutely.
So now I want to sort of bring us to the Iran-Iraq War itself. So when they sort of, you've sort of mentioned, obviously, and in also in the book, that, there's a tendency to sort of see Saddam's invasion as a purely irrational, you know, moment where there was no precedent for it. He just had this as a whim, almost like in some outside scholarship. But within your book, you make very clear there's actually a history to why he thought he could invade. I mean, it wasn't just obviously the fact that there had been a revolution in Iran, saw the government as being weaker, fearful of the spread of revolutionary Shiism, which is the sort of normal things you sort of hear about. But there was actually reason for him to think that the population of Khuzestan might be susceptible to him and to what he wanted to build there. So could you perhaps tell us how the sort of Iraqi discourse influenced Saddam's thinking and how he's sort of, rational within that framework?
Right. So I don't necessarily know that I know Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party issued booklets and pamphlets. And I know that Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party newspapers were writing about Khuzestan. I don't know what was in his heart. I'm just connecting dots. So it's clear to me that it wasn't as though he woke up one morning and said, "We want this oil. There are Arabs there. That's a good pretense." It's very clear to me that over the course of several decades, there had been both political actors who were very interested in Khuzestan, and there were, by political actors, I mean actually the previous presidents, and scholarly ideologues who were writing extensively about this area, who were traveling extensively in this area. A lot of them were from Basra. And so they would go back and forth. They would meet leaders of political opposition parties. The Ba'ath Party funded underground political partisan movements, or I should say Arab partisan movements in this area. So without question, Saddam Hussein was aware that there was a legacy of Arab disillusionment in this area. And it was not unreasonable to think that during the revolution, when these Arabs, these same Arabs, were very assertively making connections like Tehran is, or Khomeini and the Islamic Republic are oppressing us just as Israel oppresses Palestine. It's not unreasonable for him to think, well, they would greet me as a liberator because I'm a pan-Arab leader. And something else that we tend to downplay, Saddam Hussein really did see himself as inheriting Gamal Abdel Nasser's legacy. So he saw this, and the way that scholars had written about it had always been an extension of the Israel-Palestine paradigm. That just as Palestinians are oppressed, which is sad, but our brothers just across the border are being oppressed in the same way, and we're not doing anything about it. So that clearly shaped his vision of what that invasion would be like. There's some interesting, there's a very comprehensive book about the Iran-Iraq War that came out, I think in 2017, and it's titled The Iran-Iraq War, by Pierre, I think his last name is Razou. And he writes very eloquently about this, that that when Iraq invaded, they were really surprised that this was not their reception. And I think that's something that we should take seriously.
So, what was the impact of the Iraqi invasion on Khuzestan itself? I mean, you wrote about this in the book. It seems to have consolidated the fact that they're not Iraqi in that area. So, tell us about what the actual invasion and the end of the war actually did for Khuzestan?
My When you go to Khuzestan, and I spent some time there doing research on the book, one thing veterans will always point out right away, it's very interesting. It's so part of the mentality there that nobody greeted them as liberators. This is very clear and strong for them. And my feeling has always been when you look at the way that that invasion was executed, how could they have been greeted as liberators? It was a very violent invasion. So their immediate reaction, their immediate response was to defend themselves. Now, that doesn't mean that Iranians thought that they were completely trustworthy, and this is something I document a little bit in the book. I'm not an oral historian, and so I don't do it as much as I wish I could. I'm just not trained in that way. I was really trained to look at text. But something you hear a lot from veterans who are not from Khuzestan is, oh, well, we didn't really trust the locals. You know, they were Arab, and so, and that is something that is very offensive to the local population that made enormous sacrifices. Um, and indeed, the state itself consolidates around this vision of Arab Iranians as truly Iranian. You see Arabic language publications that validate their Iranianness through the Arabic language, which was very novel and interesting. You see, um, you see a lionizing of those who fought in the war who were from Khuzestan. At the same time, that area had to be evacuated right away. And so you actually don't have a lot of people staying in a war zone. And so they leave. And the treatment of these migrants has been abysmal. There is no question about that internally within Iran. I wrote about this in a different article, but a lot of them ended up in places like Esfahan and Shiraz, where they, you know, even 20 years later are reporting that they're not treated fairly and that people judge them for being Arab but that they still feel connected to Iran. And so, like, to me, as a historian of the community more than the war, I wish I could have done more on the war. It seems to me that the war resolved the matter of Iran in the minds of Iranians, not in the minds of the local Arab population that never asked for that and never wanted that. It resolved for them the matter that these Arab Iranians were loyal to Iran. But it did not eliminate the issue of migration. There's still a ton of migration in between these two countries. And if you travel there, people will talk very openly about that. That it's very easy to get to Iraq. A lot of us are going back and forth. And you see that also in the movement from Iraq to Iran, both during the Intifada after the war ended, but also after the American invasion of Iraq. So there's just a continued movement there.
So now thinking about where we move on from all of this in the sort of future, what sort of questions do you think still needs to be explored about border peoples, the people of Khuzestan, Arab people of Khuzestan, as well as the Iranian Iraqis? What sort of research and questions need to be asked now?
I have my own prejudices about what I think are really interesting, so I'll lay those out and then people can decide if they're interesting or not. Um, I'm very curious about internal migration. So this is something that I want to explore more, and I hope I see more exploration of this. Um, One of the things that I kind of conclude the book with is after the American invasion of Iraq, there is a lot of migration into Iran. And then a lot of those people return to, I should actually say that during the Intifada, there was a lot of migration to Iran. And then after the American invasion, a lot of those people return. And that's not something that's been studied, which is really surprising to me. I mean, you would think we're talking about, you know, hundreds of thousands of people move. There should be more on what happens. How do they retain their citizenship? Where did they settle? What were they allowed to do, not allowed to do? Um, because it seems to me that the expectation from the Islamic Republic was that they would stay at first. And then after the war, after America's invasion, the expectation was that they would leave. And so was that coordinated? How did that? There's a lot of questions there that I find very interesting. Um, and then one thing that we haven't talked about, but the major immigrant population in Iran that gets a lot of attention is the Afghan refugees in Iran. There are a lot of them. They're highly visible in urban areas. Um, I would personally be very interested to know better, to know more about the way that the Iranian state has handled Afghan labor as compared to the labor coming from other Gulf Arab countries, because it's not just Iraqis. I'm just interested in the way that Arabs assimilated or did. I'm one thing that you hear a lot about. Again, I didn't include this in the book because it was from kind of an oral source. The one thing you hear a lot from Iranians about the expelled Iranian Iraqis is that they assimilated really well, that they moved into these neighborhoods and that they embraced Iran for housing them. And it's the immigrant gratitude framework, and that all turned out well, which doesn't cohere with how many returned at different times, but it does cohere, in my view, with the fact that there was a big difference in the way that certain people of Iranian heritage were treated, even if they didn't have citizenship, which speaks to the Afghan issue. So how does that then work for Afghan refugees who are, not so anyway, there's a lot of very comparative research that can be done. Um, so yeah, the other thing that I wish I had done more of in the book and that I think will be done more of in the future is um, comparing the Arab experience to the Kurdish experience, because they also have these ties on multiple national borders. How are they assimilating, not assimilating, being absorbed, not absorbed? So I just think that on the subject of immigration, there have been so many really good studies of nationalism and immigration for Iran that stretch into like the 30s and 40s. Um, I mean, seminal books like Firuze Khashoggi's book is amazing on frontiers in Iran. And my hope was to kind of push that out further into the 70s and 80s and say we can do even more of this later on when the states do become more sophisticated.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like one of the things we're gonna be interested in is the idea of the model minority within an Iranian context.
Yes, totally. That was my sensibility about the Arab Iranians, um, that they were considered problematic by Iranians, but then the Iraqis of Iranian descent were considered really model minorities. Like they assimilated, everything was fine. So it was to me, it's a very interesting. I didn't write about this again because I didn't. I wanted to really focus on the articulation of loyalty from the immigrants themselves. But there is a lot of very interesting work that can be done on that particular topic. And again, it tells you something about the way that not just because we think about immigration in a Western context, we don't think about it as much in modern Middle East contexts, even though there is a lot of it. I mean, you do get a lot of that research from historians of Lebanon, for instance, or historians of Syria, because there are these major, massive changes. But there's just so much work to be done on this topic for other areas. And I'm just really excited to be part of that as just a very, very tiny contribution to that wider discourse.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to think about the Kurds as well, because when we think about the Masa Amini protests that were started with the killing of Masa Amini in 2022, a part of the obviously the discourse a lot of the discourse was rightly focused around the fact that this young woman had been killed a modern Iranian woman had been killed in Tehran, which resonated with so many people across Iran. But there's also an element of she's not from Tehran, she's from the Kurdish regions. She goes out to Tehran, and if you're sitting in these regions, you're sitting there thinking, oh, we send our daughter to Tehran and they kill her. So
Exactly. Exactly. To me, there was also another subtext of Kurds in general are perceived Um, their political organizations have been very secular and left-wing in orientation. And so that she was a Kurdish young woman, there was something there too, that here was a person who was a vulnerable woman to begin with, who whose family um, probably had some background or some knowledge about their own, ethnic political heritage. And then they send their kid right to Tehran, that is supposed to be a safer urban, like more liberal. I shouldn't say safer, but more liberal. And right, this happens to her. And so you're right. There is, yes, you're absolutely right. It is very interesting to me that some of in fact, this is a lot of the research that's been done on minority populations are particularly around the issue of labor and um, minority rights. And that's ubiquitous. Anywhere you find minorities, they're always the ones pushing to expand whatever. It could even be like not having anything to do with their faith, just on rights in general, that they are the most vocal and productive in these spaces. So yes, you're absolutely right.
It seems like there's a lot for us there to think about. But Shaherzad Ahmadi, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you've missed this one, would like to catch up or watch previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website. But please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.